Welcome to episode 8 of Our Vices, where we explore the tenure of each vice president in 3 simple questions. Question number 1. How did Martin Van Buren become vice president? Born in Kinderhook, New York, Van Buren's family owned a small tavern and spoke Dutch as a first language. Martin certainly did not come from privilege, but as we will see, he learned to use what he had to maximum effect. Martin was a social child who learned early how to interact with the wider world through customers at the family tavern. Showing promise as a student, he became an apprentice to the Sylvesters, a father and son law firm, where Van Buren consciously shed his salt-of-the-earth ways, and by the time he passed the bar in 1803, he had the appearance and bearing of a man from the upper crust of New York society. As a lawyer, Van Buren took on the powerful Livingston family by representing their disgruntled tenants. This caught the eye of the Clinton family, political rivals of the Livingstons. In one high-profile case surrounding the murder of Alexander Hamilton by Aaron Burr, Van Buren successfully represented Aaron Burr's second, William Van Ness, standing trial for accessory to murder. This win led quickly to Van Buren becoming the Columbia County surrogate. In 1812, Van Buren won election to the New York State Senate, and in 1815, he became the state attorney general. In this role, he formed a political faction around himself, known as the Bucktail Republicans, rivaling the Clintonian faction, taking on the same role as Aaron Burr's former Burrites. And in 1821, Van Buren won a seat in the U.S. Senate and organized a constitutional convention in New York State, which lowered the land requirement to obtain suffrage, which more than doubled the number of men in New York State who could now vote, to the detriment of the older political families reliant on the votes of large landowners. Van Buren's Bucktails grew from a grassroots opposition party to becoming the establishment, known as the Albany Regency. Senator Van Buren made sure to keep his thumb on the pulse of state politics even while in D.C. Bringing all his charm and intellect to the nation's capital, Van Buren, having a firm grip on New York politics, also could be relied upon to deliver the electoral votes of New York to whomever he pleased. Long-term, however, it is clear that Van Buren had presidential aspirations of his own. Van Buren began forming political alliances with Southern senators, even to the exclusion of fellow Northerners. In an attempt to at least plant the seeds of a national coalition, specifically in 1823, he aligned his Albany Regency with the Richmond Junto, which controlled Virginia politics at the time, mirroring the Virginia and New York alliance that propped up the Virginia dynasty. In 1824, Van Buren paid a visit to both former presidents John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. It became clear Martin sought to be part of the executive branch. In the Senate, however, Van Buren, in the closing days of the era of good feelings, developed the opinion that the party of Jefferson, which we now call the Democratic Republicans, in their absorption of the former Federalists, like John Quincy Adams, had lost their way and were no longer the party of small, responsible government. Van Buren became the leading organizer of a coalition he built around the figure of Senator Andrew Jackson, for whom many believed should have won the 1824 presidential election, if not for the corrupt bargain that led to John Quincy becoming president. Van Buren placed the Albany Regency and the Richmond Junto in league with the Vice President John C. Calhoun's followers to back another Jackson campaign. Van Buren became somewhat of a precursor to the modern campaign manager for Jackson and framed Jackson as a war hero and a new Jefferson. Soon after, Jackson won the presidency. Van Buren won his race for the governor of New York, which he quickly resigned to become Jackson's Secretary of State. Jackson promised to only serve one term, probably influencing Van Buren's sudden move to the presidential cabinet. As Secretary of State, Van Buren crafted a great trade deal with the United Kingdom, opened relations with the Ottoman Empire, giving U.S. merchants access to the Black Sea, and negotiated compensation from France for Americans who lost property during the Napoleonic era, when the French were seizing American ships. The man was unstoppable. From President Jackson's point of view, Van Buren was the politician he could never be, who helped get him into the White House, the person he could ask questions to without fear of judgment, and someone who could genuinely make him laugh. Meanwhile, his vice president, John C. Calhoun, seemed to be actively making problems for President Jackson. Calhoun, more than any other individual, is responsible for the nullifier movement in South Carolina that threatened the integrity of the Union. It was also revealed at this time that Calhoun had previously tried to have Jackson court-martialed for his invasion of Florida. Calhoun's wife, Fluoride, was the primary instigator of the Petticoat Affair, which tore the presidential cabinet in two. Not only did Van Buren negate the influence of fluoride in the high society of D.C., he convinced Jackson to purge his cabinet. Van Buren giving the first resignation. Everyone followed with the exception of the Postmaster General. Then Jackson turned to Van Buren to quickly fill the new cabinet with his hand-picked men. Soon after, Van Buren leaves for the United Kingdom as an unconfirmed ambassador, only to be nominated over Calhoun to be Jackson's vice presidential running mate. Calhoun, as vice president, used his tie-breaking vote in the Senate to deny confirmation of Van Buren's position as ambassador. Senator Benton told Calhoun, "You have broken a minister and elected a vice president." Within a year, Jackson would win his re-election, and Van Buren would have Calhoun's job. Which brings us to question number 2. What did Martin Van Buren accomplish during his time as vice president? President Jackson actually offered to resign after the election and hand the presidency over to Van Buren, who rejected this scheme. Many characterize Martin as a conniving politician, but he genuinely cared for President Jackson. One of the first things Van Buren did as vice president was to temper down the anger of the president toward the nullifiers in South Carolina, believing the deal brokered in the Senate would resolve the issue without Jackson treating the crisis as a rebellion. For the rest of Van Buren's term as vice president, he became the go-between for Jackson and the Senate, coaching Jackson on how to respond to senators for maximum effect, and advising President Jackson during his Senate censure. Jackson also continued to seek Van Buren's recommendations to positions Jackson needed to fill, which kept Van Buren influential. The two men would often go riding together. Unlike past presidential pairings, they were good friends. Van Buren, a widower like Jackson, seemed to understand Jackson's infamous moods with a little more nuance than others in D.C. In the Senate, Van Buren proved to be an able presiding officer, having ample experience at this point in legislative bodies of government. When Van Buren felt compelled to have his point of view heard, he usually had Senator Silas Wright of New York present Van Buren's arguments as his own. Van Buren had to negate the rumors from the South that he was a growing abolitionist, and accusations from the North that he was a Southern apologist. Van Buren, for his part, knew the Democratic Party's greatest strength over competitors was its national agenda and careful management of sectional interests. His former friend and then rival John C. Calhoun introduced a resolution to the Senate that would allow post offices in the South to confiscate abolitionist reading materials sent by U.S. mail. With a tie vote on the Senate floor, the tie-breaking vote fell to Van Buren. Remember, in the reverse position, Calhoun as vice president denied Van Buren his post to the United Kingdom. Van Buren, however, voted for Calhoun's resolution, whereas opponents like Calhoun to the Democratic Party hoped this vote would internally divide the party. Van Buren diffused the issue, refusing to vote along a North-South divide. When not presiding over the Senate, Van Buren traveled the country, renewing contacts and alliances, and supported President Jackson's agenda wherever he could. Again, maintaining an unrivaled party unity at the time when the United States as a whole began developing tears. This networking, undertaken by the vice president, also implicitly positioned him to be the heir apparent to President Jackson. At the 1835 Democratic National Convention, Van Buren, with Jackson's support, received the vote of every delegate in attendance, becoming the Democratic presidential nominee in the 1836 election. With his record of giving some deference to each region of the U.S. at one time or another, Jackson's popularity and the continued disorganization of the competing Whig Party, Van Buren won his race, becoming the youngest president ever elected up to that point, and the first president from New York. Which brings us to question number 3. What legacy did Martin Van Buren create during his time as vice president? With 19 tie-breaking votes in the Senate, Van Buren is tied in 4th place, only behind Vice President Harris, Calhoun, and Adams for the most tie-breaking votes. Van Buren, one of the founders of the Democratic Party, also spent his term as vice president traveling and tying together the pieces of this new party, which originally was known informally as the Party of Jackson or the Jacksonian Party. Van Buren made it into a party larger than just one man, a party that would outlive them all. Van Buren was the first vice president to be endorsed as the successor to the sitting president, something common in recent history but non-existent before him. Van Buren as vice president was an asset to Jackson and vice versa. The two men crafted roles for one another, and for the first time ever, the vice president was truly part of the president's team, not an adversary or party rival. Van Buren took on the job of vice president with the same attitude as the little boy in his family's Kinderhook Tavern. Instead of seeing the job as neither executive nor legislative, he saw the position as the link between both branches. Instead of viewing the president as one heartbeat in the way of his success, he found that with patience, a great ally could be made. He made politicians actually want to be vice president again. Tune in next time as we move on from Calhoun and Van Buren to the most influential vice presidents of all time, to Richard Mentor Johnson, a square peg in a round hole.